just a couple things like test, test, 1, 2.
Test, test, one, two, three. Hello there. How are you doing today?
Cool. All right. And also test, test, 1, 2, 1, 2. Cool. All right. I'm getting feedback. All right. The video is going. All right. So you ready?
Yeah, sure.
All right. And thank you, by the way, for hopping on and doing this with me today. I seriously appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So could you please state your name and age?
Hello, my name is Danielle Langlois, and I am 31 at this point,
And
I
what
think.
is your affiliation with esports and how long have you been a part of the community?
So I am actually a researcher in esports. I started doing games-related research when I was working on my master's degree in like 2017, I think. But it wasn't necessarily esports specific at that point. And then I went off and did a bunch of different things. And as of 2022, I kind of came back into the gaming space and ended up working within esports. So it's only been really a few years, but I've been involved in esports from an academic and I guess more professional capacity. But I have been sort of on the side of the esports community for a lot longer than that, just purely as somebody who played games throughout much of my youth. So I guess in a professional capacity about 2 years, but obviously esports has been happening a lot longer than that, and I've been watching it for a lot longer than
Yeah, love to see our long-term fans. And next
that.
question's a bit of a curveball, but what are your thoughts on the discrimination against women and marginalized genders in esports today?
Well, I think it's interesting because this is kind of a greater macrocosm, I guess, of a larger effect, larger things that are happening, I
Yeah.
guess. I think saying that discrimination exists in the context of esports is like saying the sky is blue, because discrimination exists in virtually every aspect of our life, um, in every capacity whatsoever. I mean, gaming, for example, has a very long and storied history with sexism. I have sexism in particular is just one of the facets because obviously racism and everything, every ism you can possibly think of is probably a problem within the gaming space.
Yeah.
You could come up with somebody to tell you something about that. But I would say within the context of esports, it does seem that there's definitely some degree of discrimination. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what's going on. So can you rephrase the question again? Just
Yeah, so I'd ask, what are your thoughts on the discrimination?
okay. Thoughts. Okay,
Yeah.
I had a panic moment because I thought, oh God, was she asking me about my own experiences
No,
or just
you're
like
good,
general
you're
thoughts?
good.
Sometimes I forget the questions after they've been asked.
I'm like
Um,
that too. You're good.
yeah. So I think that it's just one of those things that is a reality of life, and we have to work on moving forward. I think to say it doesn't exist would just be silly. Um, so it's more about what different groups are being impacted in a negative way and how we can work on fixing it for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. I like that take. And have you ever personally been discriminated against within esports or even out? And if you're okay with answering, how and
Mhm.
when?
So I think this is a complicated question because the people who are discriminating against you are not necessarily going to walk up to you and say, hello, I am discriminating against you. Please go away now.
Yeah.
That's not really how that kind of stuff typically happens. People will do so often unconsciously. They may not mean to be making those kind of decisions. It may not come from a place of malice. They may not even realize that they're doing it. So I would say in some ways, yes, I've dealt with a degree of discrimination in life just as a person growing up female or assigned female at birth, I guess. Um, so I think it's God, there's so many little examples. I can maybe narrow it into the context of like my professional life and then also in the context of gaming. One of the things that I definitely faced when I was young was that I was told over and over and over as a child and as a young person who was interested in games that games were for boys. And that it was weird that I would like kind of when my brothers were at school And if I happened to be homesick for the day, that I snuck into my brother's room and stole a Nintendo DS. I don't think it was the DS. It was one of the handhelds.
Yeah,
Um, and played Pokemon for the whole day when I was sick one day. And it felt like I had to play as far as I possibly could and then give it back to my brothers because I couldn't let anybody know that I was playing their games. And my parents, I don't think really would have cared that much, but it was just, I was already kind of a tall, overweight, often perceived as masculine girl. And so I had to be as feminine as possible. And so things that were for boys were kind of off limits to me because I didn't want to be misgendered. I was already being misgendered on a day-to-day basis. Like as a child, just being told that I looked like a boy and I sounded like a boy and all these other things because I have a naturally kind of lower voice.
yeah.
And so that is something that I definitely dealt with a great deal. And that would kind of extend into other, I guess, potentially more violent things. I was raised in like a military background, and so both of my parents actually served in the military. My father for a while longer than my mother, but both of them were service members. And so we grew up on military bases, and that means other military kids. And some of those kids had maybe not the best view of women and not the best view of femininity. And I have these like horrible memories of wanting to go play video games with my brother because we had this old Super Nintendo and we had like one of the older Mortal Kombat games. And I remember them playing it and going into that room and wanting to play with my siblings because I spent a lot of time playing with my younger siblings. We were trapped in this small house and those were your playmates. And there would also be like neighbor kids over there. And I have this just very strong, like crystallized memory of this one boy in our neighborhood who would come over to play Mortal Kombat and he would set up a game where he wasn't playing with anybody. Nobody was allowed to play with him. But he would pick his favorite character and then he would pick up the other controller and select one of the female characters that were playable on this Mortal Kombat. And then he would proceed to beat up the female character and talk about how beating women was, the best thing he could do and how cool he was. But he would only do it when I was in the room. And my brothers were a lot younger than him, and so it was just a really weird dynamic where like none of my siblings and I were really comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But nobody knew what to do. So it was just kind of a really like horrible crystallized memory that my brothers even now are just like, I can't believe that happened. That was so
Wow.
upsetting.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
crazy. I hope that kid grew out of that or like got help.
Well, he was an interesting character. I don't really, to be frank, I hated him and
Yeah.
didn't really care what happened to him after that. I'm not the sort of person who like looks up what people are doing now
Yeah.
as an adult. I wish him the best. I hope he got over that, is all I
Yeah.
have to say.
Yeah, that's
But
crazy.
yeah, that was probably one of the most violent instances of discrimination that I experienced
Yeah.
as like a young person.
Yeah.
And then when you get into the professional world, I think again, like being a person who presents as female and of course being, not super skinny and maybe not being the most extroverted, there are definitely situations where I get treated in ways where it's like, oh, you just don't want me to exist. So you may have heard this online. I've heard a lot of fellow plus size women talking about this, about how we know whether our friends' boyfriends are good or not by whether they treat us like a human or not. And that's kind of a common experience that a lot of plus size folks have,
Yeah.
is because a lot of people believe that we, I guess, aren't human or don't deserve to exist. And little things like that. And again, nobody's going to march up to you and say, you're disgusting and I hate you. I mean, some people will, but
Yeah.
luckily I've not run into those people, thankfully.
Yeah.
But that kind of stuff does exist. And definitely in professional settings, I have in the past looked at getting a breast reduction surgery, so
Yeah.
a type of surgery, just to make my body a different shape so that people would look at me and not at my chest.
Yeah.
Like little things like that stack up when you're a person like in these spaces.
Yeah.
So
You
yeah,
shouldn't have to think like that. Like you should just be able to
yeah.
exist as you. I get that. Yeah. That's ridiculous.
Hmm.
Can I
Yeah.
ask what do you kind of know like around the year that incident happened with that when you were a kid, roughly?
Oh gosh, that would have been the early 2000s. probably anywhere in the range of like 2004 to 2006.
Okay.
And I should also note about that is that again, we were on a military base. All of our dads were gone. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of kids were dealing with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's that's one reason why I don't really think about this particular boy very much because like he was going through stuff the same way the rest of us were.
Yeah, for sure.
You know.
Yeah, I wanted to gauge a bit of like the difference of then versus now of like
Oh
the
yeah, for
like
sure.
caliber
I
of
I
what you experienced then versus like what
mhm.
you've experienced now.
I feel things have generally gotten better.
Yeah.
Um, that is my overall impression. Though with some of the bizarre stuff you see online, you know, like the Warhammer 40K stuff that was happening recently.
Yeah.
Um, how dare you have female characters
Yeah.
in my game? Like, and I don't know, I find that one particularly funny and weird because like, wasn't it 2 years ago we were all freaking out and all these men wanted Lady Dimitrescu to step on them? Like, what is happening?
Yeah, it's always going in weird directions. It's stupid, but
hmm hmm
um
Like, make a decision, babe.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, so going off of your experiences, have you ever witnessed someone else that you know or just someone just in general being discriminated against as well in that way?
Oh, yes. Again, I think as a human person, if you walk around and you pay attention for long enough, you will see instances of discrimination. I don't think it's
Yeah.
that difficult if you're paying attention. So I'll give you a couple of different examples, I guess, across like different life experiences. So I have a sibling, I have three siblings, so
Hmm.
pretty big family, right? One of my siblings was diagnosed with pretty intense dyslexia.
Mm.
And so as a result, she had accommodations throughout schooling, things like, you know, she had slightly longer periods in which time in which to take her tests, little things like that.
Yeah.
Very normal. This is very common. Like I've taught at the university level and I've done it for years. So I am accustomed to dealing with, you know, various things like that. You know, you just work with the Disability Services Center and usually it's not that hard.
Yeah.
It's not that difficult. But I do know that there were times when she was working on her degree at the university level where instructors were not wanting to allow her to use her accommodations. Those accommodations exist for a reason,
Yeah.
and she is perfectly capable if you just give her those accommodations. But there were definitely some of her instructors that I know made her feel really bad for just asking for this thing that we knew exactly how to resolve. And again, like I had worked as an instructor at that point, and I was furious because I was working with students every single day and just working with the student like disability services department. It is not that hard,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I can't tell you the number of times that I like just printed out a test that has slightly larger text, or you know, you just send your exam to like a disability services office, and you say, okay, you know, schedule your test for whatever time works for you and the office within this amount of days. It's truly from the professor's angle, it's really not that hard in my opinion, and
Yeah.
it still infuriates me that she had that experience. So I would say that's definitely a form of discrimination. I think also I've been in situations where like this is 2024, obviously. The pandemic was in 2020. I was actually in graduate school in the United States a couple of years ago, and I noticed when we moved to online-only classes that there was kind of some subtle discrimination stuff happening, and I don't even think it was like intentional on
Yeah.
behalf of the professors, but there were a lot of professors who wanted to keep synchronous classes. So essentially what they were doing was they wanted everybody to come in, log into Zoom, and attend classes on Zoom, which sounds great, except for the fact that we had a lot of students in our faculty, and we knew this, that did not have good internet access or any internet access at all at their homes.
Yeah.
And so it was a constant fight where, and I was a graduate student at the time, so I wasn't super like in the know on all of it, but I definitely heard some of the little like snarky, oh, well, why can't they just attend class? And they were so shocked when I at the time was teaching. And so I just said, I'm moving completely non-synchronously. I'm just going to upload lectures and let the students listen to them whenever, because there's nothing I can do. I know that a lot of these students do not have good internet access at home. We were in a place where a lot of our students were low income.
Yeah.
And so it's just something you have to think about. And there's just little things you can do. But some of these kind of older professors who were very used to their way of doing things did not want to think about that stuff because it wasn't their job to think about it.
Yeah. It's crazy
So,
how deep rooted a lot of this stuff is, to the point where like they don't realize they're doing it, and that's frustrating. That's extremely frustrating.
and again, I don't think that they were trying to be malicious or anything. It's just most of them had never really had much interaction with technology, so of course Zoom was scary to them.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think we did see during the pandemic as well, is that, there were a lot of older people who were kind of left behind because they just didn't have the same access to technology. They weren't as accustomed to it, and that's a form of discrimination too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely not, I think, touched on a lot of people being able to adapt to things. Like, it's like people are like, well, once you're set in your ways, you're set in your ways. And
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's something I've definitely seen being an American who lives in Europe, is that, people are very used to their way of doing things, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, kind of interesting how that crops up in odd ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just a bunch of little things. I remember, like, for my whole childhood and even like up into adulthood, the way Black people were treated and told, you're too aggressive, or you're too this, or you're too that. Like, I have very conscious memories of hearing some of these arguments, and I like to think we've at least moved past some of them.
Yeah.
But that's not the case with everyone. Even like LGBTQ rights, that's a whole other thing. Even actually, I do have a somewhat positive story about this that's kind of related.
Yeah.
So when I was once again getting my master's degree, I had my mentor, who I care very deeply for, is he's an older white man. He's, definitely probably got a more conservative lean to him, but he's a very nice person.
Yeah.
I've always liked him. And I remember he and I were having a conversation once, and one of my, I guess, classmates came up, and this classmate was a trans woman.
Yeah.
And he had known this trans woman before she had transitioned. And so he accidentally misgendered her in a conversation talking with me. But he noticed it immediately, and immediately was like, oh, sorry, I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I'm so sorry. And he continued to not misgender her for the whole rest of the time.
Yeah.
And this is, an older-ish white man. So I feel like if he can do it, so can you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
You just apologize and move on. And this person wasn't even in the room.
Yeah.
She has no idea this conversation happened.
Yeah. It's a conscious
still,
thing. Yeah. No, I get that.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice. That's nice to see, especially with someone who is in the teaching capacity that people can look up to, can set that example. I like that. Speaking of,
I like to think that most instructors do care about their students.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Some don't.
Yeah.
Some do.
I know most of my instructors definitely care about all of us. That, like, for sure. It's nice to see. It's sometimes a rarity, which is unfortunate, but circling back to actually the first question, since we're on education and everything, I did want to ask, like, what do you research within esports, and like, what do you delve into?
Okay, so it's actually kind of an interesting story. I was originally essentially hired, more or less, as a PhD student. I left one PhD program in the US because it wasn't serving me. And I realized that the topic area was not for me. The pandemic helps with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then I ended up in a different PhD program. And in that PhD program, my target area that is related to my funding and things like that is esports training. So we're looking at training people who want to get into esports, people who are already involved in esports, and looking at, like, ways we can improve existing training paradigms. Now, when I first started, it was that vague, and now we've kind of narrowed in a little bit. And I would say that we found through some exploratory research that it seemed like a lot of people felt that there was some lacking areas in terms of things like soft skills, like teamwork, communication, even like mental health, stress coping, stuff like that. And I, of course, come from a psychology background, so I saw those results and immediately said that I will take that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the direction we started going.
That's cool. That's super. That's nice to know that people are actually trying to improve on that stuff, because I do see that, the lack of that for sure, in actual
a lot
competitive.
of esports players are really young.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of them maybe don't have enough time to really develop some of those soft skills. And so if we can help them, be better, do better in those capacities, hopefully it will help their entire lives, like not just their esports performance, but their entire lives.
Yeah, for sure. I can see that being applied to other aspects of their life, definitely. Well, thank you. Moving on. So we asked if you had seen someone else be discriminated against. And so what are some of the ramifications that you think that this problem causes for the short and long term for everyone?
Ooh, that's a complicated question. My God, could I go on about that for hours? Well, I think that access is definitely something, and it's something I've seen in my own research,
Yeah.
is there are a lot of people who just do not have access to things in the same way, and they kind of get left behind.
Yeah.
And that's not really fair, because there could be, some really great esports athletes out there, but maybe they're just born into the wrong country,
Yeah.
and that's not great. Um, and I think also the one of the other capacities that I kind of immediately thought about was we have a dearth of ideas. There could be some amazing games out there, but again, like the person who has those ideas can't get in the door because maybe they don't speak the right language or they can't get into university or whatever. And then if we go beyond, I guess, the class or the geographic distribution of it, for a lot of women, I think there's like this element of stereotype threat in some ways.
Yeah.
And so that is in case people don't know, stereotype threat is a like psychological concept that
Mm-hmm.
essentially boils down to if there's a stereotype about somebody in a particular group, a person who is in that particular group might feel additional stress when it comes to perform something that is related to that stereotype. So
Yeah.
one of the classic examples is women in mathematics. So if you have a classroom of women and you just say, hey, we're going to take a math test, and then you have another classroom of women that is virtually identical in every other way, but you tell them, we're going to take a math class, but you girls don't worry too much because math is hard for women. Or you give them some kind of statement like that. The people who are in the classroom who are told, math is hard for women will do worse on the math test than those who are not told anything like that. So if people are like repeatedly being reminded of their stereotypes, if they're repeatedly walking into rooms where nobody else looks like them, and this extends again, not just to women, but to people in different races, um, different groups of people in various capacities, um, then obviously it's going to impact their performance. And I think that is probably happening in the esports capacity because there are a lot of people who, again, you may walk into an esports space and maybe you're the only girl on the team, or maybe you are a person who looks different than everybody else. Like maybe you're, I don't know, from Saudi Arabia or something, and maybe you walk in and nobody else looks like you. Then I think that can really impact people in a way that hurts their performance.
Yeah, no, I agree definitely. I've actually experienced that to some degree for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, now that I know that you have you said it was psychology or
Yes, yes.
background, I have a couple other questions that I'm going to pull up that I
Oh,
have
absolutely.
for people of that I guess degree.
Mm-hmm.
Let me pull that out real quick because I wasn't expecting that, but
Bachelor's degree and a master's degree.
that's huge. Yeah, no, I like picking people's brains about that because it's such a interesting topic, and like not it's interesting because not a lot of people know it exists, or they do know it exists, but they choose to ignore it, which is so
Mm-hmm.
interesting to me. So I'm trying to find
Well,
where
I
to put my
can
notebook.
understand some elements of some of these arguments because, for example, I am, a millennial, and so I remember the old internet.
Oh
Right?
yeah, yeah,
And so I remember one sentiment that was really strong for a long time was don't feed the trolls. So whenever somebody says something mean to you, do not respond to them
yeah,
because
yeah,
it'll
yeah,
just,
yeah.
feed the fire more. That was the idea. Unfortunately, if you don't feed the trolls, then the trolls continue to fester. So there is some positives to actually addressing some of those people, especially when they're making really poor faith arguments that are not logically sound.
Yes.
And so, but again, as a creator, I feel like, and a lot of esports players are also streamers. This is something that they have to deal with. Do I, boot people? Do I ignore them? Do I interact with people who are being hateful? What choices are they going to make, and how is that going to impact them?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So I can't find it, but I can kind of remember the questions that I had lined up. So
Oh, I'm sorry. I probably should have told you before.
no, it's okay. I am a-okay with things being like off the cuff. It makes it more natural
Okay.
and like it's like genuine. So one of the questions that I did have was, I know that this problem, like sexism, misogyny, all that stuff, is extremely deep rooted, just because that's kind of like how our society
Hmm.
started. But
It's
for
existed for thousands of years at this point.
yes, yeah. So
Hmm.
for the people who do not know, could you kind of give a small rundown of like why this has been a part of our society for so long, and just kind of why it is as big of a deal as it is, just in layman's terms, if
Ooh.
you're able.
So this is kind of a problem that I know evolutionary psychologists have looked at, as well as like philosophers, anthropologists, things like this. One could argue that a lot of this stems from the fact that females are inherently more valuable than males because we are the ones who create more of the humans. And so, you could argue that females are more important to protect, even though we are perfectly capable. In fact, I know that there's been some recent research that indicates actually that in a lot of ancient cultures, uh, that there wasn't like a super strong or a lot of like the ancient hunter-gatherer societies, for example. When I was a child, we were always being taught that the women picked the berries and did the foraging and the men went out and hunted. But I believe a lot of modern anthropologists are actually finding that that was not the case. And so they are finding an increasing amount of like kind of a less divisive social strata, I guess, would be the way of phrasing it. Um, so I think it's kind of a difficult question to answer because it depends on like how far back you want to go. I would say in Western society, it seems like we've had definitely an issue with misogyny for a very long time. And I think that it is possible that we maybe could trace that back to the religious beliefs, because if you look at the God of Abraham, I guess would be the best way of saying it. Religion is kind of a personal interest of mine, which the God of Abraham is essentially Yahweh, Allah, God, God, capital G. Um, this is the God that is worshipped by, it's essentially the same God, Muslims and Christians and Jews, and some other groups too, I believe. They may prefer not to be lumped into those other groups. Um, that culture, that ancient culture that we kind of come from, worships an inherently male deity. And I think from there you can maybe extrapolate that that might be the root of where the sexism in the West comes from.
Yeah.
Um, just purely because that was the religious group that took off the most. And I believe there's actually some research that indicates that that God, the God of Abraham, is was perhaps once a part of a different um, group of gods that was maybe worshipped in like Sumeria or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask somebody who specializes in this stuff, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that a lot of that probably comes from, really ancient roots and has just kind of spread throughout, obviously the basket, the breadbasket of civilization, or the that's what we called it when I was a kid,
Yeah.
or the cradle of civilization, in the Middle East and out into Europe and parts of Northern Africa, and then just kind of exploded outward with the colonizers, I guess would be
Yeah.
the way of saying
Yeah,
it.
yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, no. I thank you for sharing that. I will say we only have about 7 minutes. I do not have Zoom Pro, so I will have to
I
finish
got
this
you.
up. However, I would act now that I know this. I would like to, if you're okay, schedule another interview to kind of delve more into that. If you're okay with that.
Hmm. Well, I also, so I don't know if you've done this before, but you can actually reuse the same meeting link and just like log off and then log back on.
Oh, okay. Well, I
So if
also
you have more time,
I
then that's okay.
unfortunately don't, but I would love to make more time, and we can obviously
Okay.
find a date. But like that, I'm happy that you are knowledgeable on that stuff, because I am not as much, and I want to learn. Okay,
It's just a trick that I found out on accident.
there you go. Okay, so last question is,
Okay.
uh, what do you think we can do to stop or at least lessen this problem, and how close do you think we are to a solution?
Again, I think it's a greater societal problem, so I think that it's not necessarily something that we can target fix just in the context of esports and video games. It would have to be like larger societal change. I think obviously a good way to start is just including more women at the table, more people of color, more people from different backgrounds as well. Because that's something I've touched on a couple of times is just like class. Uh, People who grow up impoverished have a lot less opportunities, and it would be really nice if we got some of those people into the rooms where decisions are being made. Um, that's it sounds like kind of a cop-out answer, unfortunately, but this is a large societal problem that I think will take a long time to resolve, and we need to have patience.
Yeah, for sure. Making sure that's just not one big echo chamber of the same voices.
Mm-hmm.
I gotcha.
Being heard over and over. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And is there anything else that you would like to share?
I don't really have much. Just if you're super interested in esports, please contact me because I'm always collecting research data, and I could definitely use more guinea pigs.
All right.
I
Well,
promise
heck
we
yeah.
don't do anything unsavory.
All right. Well, thank you so much for today. And oh, I cut out. I never know how to end these, so
You're
I'm
fine.
just going to hit